On the night of August 31st, 1939, a small radio station near the Polish border sent out a strange broadcast. The message was short, panicked, and accusing, claiming that Polish soldiers had just attacked German soil. Within hours, the news was reported across Europe as fact. The next morning, German troops stormed into Poland and the Second World War began. But the attack wasn't real. It was staged, built on lies, fear, and silence. Every word and every gunshot had been rehearsed. The truth was buried before dawn. Europe in 1939 was already a field of dry grass waiting for a spark. Germany had rebuilt its pride through propaganda, fear, and control. Hitler's speeches filled the airwaves, each one promising justice for wrongs never done. Newspapers painted Poland as violent and arrogant, a threat to peace. Every story followed the same script, shaping a public ready to believe anything. In small towns, people whispered about war, but still went to work, hoping power and peace could coexist. They were wrong. The lie had already begun to take shape inside the walls of authority. Behind Berlin's guarded doors, the military sought a reason to invade. They had armies, tanks, and a plan, but no excuse that would convince the world. Hitler's command was clear. Germany must appear the victim. Intelligence officers gathered in a room with maps pinned to the walls. They discussed scenarios like men solving a puzzle, not plotting death. Each idea felt colder than the last. The discussion ended with one chilling concept: a fake Polish attack on German land. It would be quick, clean, and undeniable, a perfect lie designed to start a global catastrophe. The plan gained momentum under a simple code name: Operation Himmler. It sounded bureaucratic, harmless, like paperwork, but within it hid a blueprint for deception. Multiple targets were listed across the borderlands, each chosen for symbolic value. Among them stood the radio station at Gleiwitz, a quiet facility near Upper Silesia. It was ordinary, forgettable, and therefore perfect. A place where a single transmission could alter history. The officers knew they needed something public, something that could not be denied once it aired. The world would soon hear words born from a machine, not truth. Orders spread through channels with coded messages and unmarked envelopes. The operation required actors, not soldiers. They would wear the uniforms of the enemy and die wearing them. German intelligence selected men already trapped in camps, prisoners stripped of identity. The plan was to dress them as Polish saboteurs, kill them, and display their bodies as proof of an attack. To the world, they would look like aggressors. To the regime, they were disposable tools. Every layer of the plan demanded silence. Those who asked questions vanished before answers could form. History was about to be forged. While officers handled logistics, the media prepared its stage. Newspapers were given subtle hints, editorials crafted with patriotic anger. Reports of border tensions and Polish provocations filled the morning columns. People began to believe a strike was inevitable. The state radio repeated the same stories until they felt like memory, not rumor. Inside the propaganda ministry, staff worked overnight to ensure every headline could pivot toward outrage. Every photograph, every phrase, every map was a weapon. Truth had become irrelevant. The people didn't need proof anymore, only the feeling of being wronged. The stage was ready. Trucks rolled across rural roads, under the cover of clouds. They carried men, uniforms, weapons, and silence. Among them were SS officers briefed on every detail, bound by secrecy, stronger than loyalty. The prisoners sat blindfolded, unaware they would be the evidence of a crime they didn't commit. The convoy stopped near the small town of Gleiwitz, where the radio tower rose into the night sky like a needle. The plan was simple: storm the building, send a short broadcast in Polish, and leave behind proof of invasion. No mistakes were allowed. The world's attention awaited. Inside the Gleiwitz station, operators worked through a normal shift. Static crackled in the equipment, and the low hum of electricity filled the small rooms. None of them knew that by sunrise, their workplace would become a historical landmark of deceit. Security outside was minimal. The surrounding fields were still, distant lights marking the border. In nearby barracks, officers rehearsed their cover story one last time. They checked their watches, adjusted their armbands, and waited for the signal. The entire operation rested on a single transmission, one voice over the air that would reshape the world. The appointed officer in charge, Alfred Naujoks, studied the documents spread across a small wooden table. He had been chosen personally for his efficiency and loyalty. The assignment was described as patriotic, an act of service to the nation, yet the details disturbed even him. He paced the narrow corridor, glancing toward the sealed truck outside. Inside, the prisoners breathed quietly, unaware of their fate. Naujoks checked his pistol, loaded the blanks for the radio attack, and tucked the real bullets away. He had his orders, and in that moment, obedience outweighed morality. History would bear his fingerprints. The officers disguised as Polish soldiers gathered near the station fence. Their uniforms looked convincing, though their nerves betrayed them. The embroidered eagles on their caps were crisp, unweathered, the fabric too clean to belong to veterans. One man whispered about the risk, but the others ignored him. Orders were clear. They moved toward the building, cutting the lights and forcing the operators to the floor. The radio's red signal light flickered to life. Somewhere in Berlin, another officer started a stopwatch. Timing mattered. Every second of the false broadcast had been scripted like theater. Inside the small broadcasting room, a microphone stood waiting, a black cylinder that would soon carry deceit across borders. A soldier read from a sheet in shaky Polish, accusing Germany of aggression and declaring retaliation. His accent was poor, but the words didn't need to sound perfect. They only needed to exist. The transmission lasted less than a minute before the switch was pulled. In that brief signal, millions of lives were set into motion toward chaos. The soldiers stepped away, their breathing heavy, the silence afterward feeling heavier than gunfire. The message had done its work. Outside, the trucks waited with the next part of the plan. The bodies were prepared to be placed near the site. Each prisoner had been injected earlier, incapacitated beyond resistance. They were to be shot and left behind as supposed attackers. One officer hesitated before following the order, his hand shaking over the trigger. A single gunshot cracked through the air. It was followed by several more, mechanical and cold. When it ended, the truck was lighter by several men. The evidence had been planted. The story of Polish aggression now had photographs waiting to be printed. In a small office in Berlin, a phone rang. The voice on the other end delivered the confirmation. The incident at Gleiwitz is complete. The officer taking the call wrote a single line in a report, then locked it in a drawer. There was no celebration, no emotion, just the next step of a larger machine already in motion. Within the hour, state radio began repeating warnings about border attacks. Foreign correspondents were fed pre-written statements. The lie had left its birthplace and was spreading like a storm. Nobody knew its source, yet everyone would feel its impact. As dawn approached, the propaganda ministry launched a synchronized campaign. Newspapers across Germany carried the same headline: Polish forces invade German territory. Photos were printed, showing uniforms, rifles, and lifeless figures near the radio tower. Each image was cropped carefully to hide the German weapons nearby. Citizens gathered around kiosks, reading with disbelief that quickly turned to anger. The government promised swift retaliation. People demanded it. By noon, the streets were filled with rallies, songs, and flags. The lie had done more than fool them. It had inspired them. A war built on illusion now had public approval. While the public cheered, diplomats abroad tried to verify the reports. Britain and France sent urgent messages asking for evidence. The German Foreign Ministry sent back official statements confirming the attack, along with staged photographs. Poland denied everything, insisting that no such operation had been ordered, but no one believed them fast enough. The machinery of propaganda was faster than diplomacy. In the press rooms of London and Paris, editors hesitated between caution and outrage. The truth was buried under timing. Lies travel quicker when they arrive dressed as news. The first spark had already become flame. Back in Gleiwitz, the radio tower stood silent, the static humming like a heartbeat. The operators were shaken but alive, ordered never to speak of what happened. Soldiers cleared the site, removing traces of the operation before sunrise. Only a few shell casings and blood-stained uniforms remained. Local police were instructed to write official statements, each one carefully dictated word for word. Outside the fence, Farmers began their morning work, unaware that their small town had just lit the fuse of World War. The sky was still calm, but the storm was already on its way. By morning, reports of similar Polish attacks began to surface from other regions. Bridges, railway stations and customs posts were all said to be under fire. None of it was real, but repetition gave the illusion of scale. The operation had multiplied itself across the map. Newspapers printed maps with arrows pointing east, declaring Germany under siege. The average citizen believed it fully. Those who doubted stayed quiet. Fear had a new uniform, and it wore patriotism proudly. The machine of misinformation had achieved what armies alone could not: justification for destruction. At the border, German troops waited for the official order to advance. Commanders stood beside their vehicles, reading the latest bulletins confirming the so-called invasion. The Gleiwitz broadcast was now national news. Officers who suspected the truth ignored it, choosing survival over conscience. Every soldier was told they were defending the fatherland. That word, defending, made everything feel righteous. Behind them, supply lines stretched for miles, filled with tanks and fuel. The script had been written, and now it was time to perform. The invasion was no longer a matter of if, but when. Within Berlin's inner circle, the success of the operation spread like quiet celebration. Officials congratulated each other, toasting with glasses of wine. They saw the manipulation not as crime but as brilliance. One advisor noted that no foreign power could now question their self-defense. The propaganda ministry sent new headlines to print. The plan had worked perfectly, but inside that triumph was rot. Everyone who knew the truth had been ordered to forget it. Paperwork was burned, records rewritten, witnesses transferred. The lie was already fossilized into history before anyone outside the circle could question it. That evening, Now Jocks wrote his brief report in mechanical detail. He avoided emotion, describing the fake assault as successful with minor resistance. He didn't mention the prisoners or the bodies left behind. His superiors didn't ask. They wanted results, not conscience. When the report reached Himmler's desk, it was stamped and filed without comment. The document became part of the official war narrative. Later historians would find it among archives labeled routine border operations. The men who died at Gleiwitz were not given names or graves. Their silence became part of the proof that condemned a nation. While officials documented the false victory, the real troops gathered along the frontier. Thousands of men, unaware of the manipulation, believed they were responding to aggression. Radio messages filled the airwaves with orders, directions, and patriotic speeches. Across Europe, ambassadors sent urgent telegrams to confirm the truth. But the truth was gone, buried beneath official statements and sealed reports. Even neutral nations were unsure whom to believe. The stage had been set so thoroughly that no evidence could undo it. Within hours, the first artillery units received their coded orders to cross into Polish territory. At sunrise, engines roared across the open plains. Soldiers advanced under banners and commands, unaware their mission had begun with a staged broadcast. The first shells fell on Polish towns, shattering homes and bridges. Villagers fled while leaflets dropped from the sky, warning them of German defense. To the rest of the world, it appeared that Germany was retaliating against a brutal attack. The lie had taken on a life of its own, breathing fire through machinery and steel. What began as words over a radio was now echoing in the form of explosions and flame. Inside Berlin, reporters gathered for a press conference. Officials presented proof of Polish aggression, displaying captured weapons and uniforms. Every piece was arranged perfectly, though none of it had ever belonged to real soldiers. Cameras flashed as state photographers immortalized the evidence. The audience applauded when shown the photographs from Gleiwitz. The room felt triumphant. Nobody questioned the odd details, the new fabric on the uniforms, the lack of dirt, the identical boots. Truth was not the goal anymore. Certainty was. Outside, loudspeakers broadcast victory songs. The nation was unified under a carefully crafted illusion. In foreign capitals, reactions split. Some diplomats doubted Germany's claim, but without evidence, their hesitation looked like cowardice. Headlines in London and Paris carried the news cautiously, but the damage was already done. The first impression was that Poland had acted recklessly. Radio frequencies across Europe buzzed with confusion. Journalists tried to reach the Polish government, but communication lines were cut. Each unanswered call strengthened the German story. Reality had lost its footing, replaced by propaganda wrapped in authority. The seeds of war had been planted, watered by lies, and now the harvest would be ruin. In Gleiwitz, locals noticed soldiers clearing the radio tower area. Military trucks came and went, removing equipment and sealing off the perimeter. The smell of gunpowder lingered, but no one spoke about it. Workers who had been present the night before were quietly transferred to other regions. The official explanation claimed maintenance, though the fences were new and the guards unfamiliar. For days, rumors spread that something terrible had happened. Then the news confirmed it. Polish saboteurs had struck. The townspeople accepted it without question. After all, the uniforms, the photos, the news, all said the same thing. A few witnesses whispered that they saw German officers that night, not Poles. Their voices carried risk. One farmer who mentioned it at a tavern was visited the next day and never returned. Fear enforced silence better than any law. The story became official truth because denial was dangerous. Those who lived closest to the tower stopped speaking about it altogether. The building itself seemed unchanged, its tall frame cutting the sky like nothing had happened. Yet every person who passed it felt the weight of something unnatural, an event too large to name but impossible to forget. As German forces stormed across Poland, the rest of Europe scrambled to react. Leaders debated whether the invasion was retaliation or aggression. The Polish government insisted the attack at Gleiwitz was fabricated, but their words carried little reach compared to the organized machinery of Nazi propaganda. British and French diplomats held emergency meetings, drafting warnings to Germany that would go unheeded. Inside the Reich, the story was airtight, flawless, unchallenged. Every broadcast, every headline, every photograph pointed in one direction. Poland was to blame. The stagecraft had turned into global conviction overnight. Back in Berlin, the architects of Operation Himmler prepared reports for higher command. They listed the results in tidy bullet points: successful transmission, confirmed casualties, widespread public outrage. They measured lies like achievements. Each entry was proof of obedience. No one wrote about the human cost. Files were stamped, signed, and locked away. To the men who created the deception, morality was irrelevant. Only efficiency mattered. Their superiors called it a clean success. History would later call it the first move in a war that swallowed millions. For now, it was just paperwork perfectly completed. Hidden deep in one of those reports was a strange entry, an item described as evidence secured. It referred to the revolver used during the attack, the one missing a single bullet. The weapon was placed in a box labeled property of Station Gleiwitz and quietly stored. No one knew it would resurface decades later as a key artifact. That revolver symbolized everything the operation stood for: control, deceit, and silence. Those who handled it afterward called it cursed. It had fired not only bullets, but the first signal of the deadliest war the world had ever known. As chaos spread, small errors began to appear in the official story. Some reports mentioned the wrong time, others described weapons not yet in Polish service. Yet none of these contradictions mattered. Once the lie became law, facts were powerless. Officers responsible for the operation erased or replaced conflicting evidence. Anyone asking questions was labeled disloyal. The state's version of truth became sacred. The world had entered an age where even reality could be commanded. In that moment, a new kind of warfare was born, one fought not only with weapons, but with words and belief. Inside the radio tower, a janitor found a torn notebook wedged behind a control panel. The pages contained scrawled notes and a partial list of names. Some were crossed out violently. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, frightened. The janitor tucked it into his coat and left the station without speaking. Years later, the notebook would resurface as rare proof of the deception. But for now, it was just one man's quiet act of preservation against a world drowning in lies. Sometimes, history survives not through the powerful, but through those who refuse to throw it away. In Berlin, Propaganda officials refined the story even further, releasing a statement claiming Poland had planned multiple strikes. Each revision made the lie more convincing, more detailed. The original Gleiwitz script became only one of several proofs. By the time foreign diplomats demanded clarification, the invasion was unstoppable. The narrative had done its work. Germany presented itself as the victim of chaos, its leaders as reluctant defenders. The world had been cornered by its own hesitation. The power of the lie was not in its complexity, but in its simplicity. Easy to repeat, impossible to disprove. In Poland, confusion reigned. Reports of German planes and tanks flooded in before any official declaration of war. Radio operators intercepted conflicting messages, unsure whether they were genuine. When word reached Warsaw about the Gleiwitz attack, no one could believe it. The Polish officers knew it was fabricated, but couldn't prove it. The world's disbelief gave Germany time to solidify its story. By the time diplomats gathered evidence, borders had already been crossed. Truth had no microphone loud enough to compete with lies backed by artillery. History was moving faster than honesty could travel. Meanwhile, the people of Gleiwitz went about their routines, living beside a monument of deceit. The station returned to regular broadcasts, the incident mentioned only in whispers. Soldiers guarded it casually, pretending nothing unusual had occurred. For the locals, pretending was survival. Shops opened, children went to school, and every clock ticked forward as if innocence could still exist. Yet beneath that normality, the guilt of an entire nation pulsed. The tower stood tall, a silent participant in a crime that disguised itself as patriotism. To many, it became just another building, but it was anything but ordinary. Berlin's newspapers hailed the military's swift response to the Polish attacks. Editorials spoke of justice, courage, and unity. Photographs showed cheering crowds and marching soldiers. Every image was carefully chosen to erase doubt. People wanted to believe, and that desire made deception effortless. Families hung flags outside their homes, proud of a war they didn't yet understand. The human tendency to seek meaning in chaos had been weaponized. No one questioned why the supposed aggressor was already being invaded so quickly. By the time realization could arrive, the truth was buried under victory parades. Foreign journalists tried to travel to Gleiwitz to verify the story firsthand. They were turned away by guards citing security concerns. Those who managed to get near the border found checkpoints closed, their papers invalid. Only state-approved correspondents were allowed near the scene, and their reports matched the official version perfectly. The cover-up was airtight. Each layer of restriction became another piece of evidence supporting the lie. Without witnesses, the false narrative became unshakable. In a world where communication moved slower than propaganda, whoever spoke first controlled the story, and Germany had shouted the loudest. Across Europe, people felt unease, but pretended certainty. The tension in every household was a reflection of the tension between nations. Radios buzzed with patriotic speeches and declarations of duty. Yet behind the volume of national pride, an emptiness grew. Some citizens felt that something about the timing was too precise, too perfect. But suspicion alone was useless, without proof. Truth needed courage, and courage was scarce under regimes built on fear. Those who still questioned the story learned to stay quiet. Silence had become the safest response to the sound of marching boots. At the German command center, telegrams confirmed the invasion's success. Towns along the Polish border had fallen quickly. Resistance scattered. Officers congratulated themselves for the seamless operation. No one mentioned the lie that started it all. The Gleiwitz incident was already fading from reports, replaced by stories of battlefield victories. What had been vital yesterday became irrelevant today. The false flag had served its purpose, now buried under the noise of real war. In bureaucracies of destruction, truth was temporary, but lies had permanence. They left fewer questions, and required no explanation once the shooting began. Meanwhile, the international community struggled to interpret events. Britain and France issued warnings to Germany, demanding withdrawal. German representatives responded with carefully prepared statements, citing self-defense. Each meeting became a performance, with diplomats pretending civility while knowing the decisions were already made elsewhere. Letters and telegrams crossed oceans carrying contradictions, none of which mattered anymore. The narrative created by the Gleiwitz hoax had set everything in irreversible motion. Diplomacy could no longer stop what propaganda had already justified. The lie had become too large to confront without acknowledging complicity. The world was trapped inside its echo. Inside the propaganda ministry, editors reviewed footage of the border attacks. Stage-managed reels showed explosions filmed during training exercises, now presented as evidence. The footage was edited with precision, the sound of gunfire synchronized to inspire emotion. Movie theaters played these reels before newsreels, turning deceit into entertainment. The audience gasped and applauded, believing what they saw. The power of image over truth was complete. The manipulation had evolved beyond politics. It had entered the realm of art. The architects of lies had discovered that emotion could replace evidence if presented with enough confidence. In a dim room at the Gleiwitz station, one of the technicians sat alone, staring at the control panel. He had followed orders, turned switches, and kept his mouth shut. The static from the radio filled the space like a reminder. He opened a drawer and found his work badge, edges worn, his name faded. He thought about the transmission, about how simple it had been, just a few words over the air. Yet those words had unleashed a world's worth of pain. He switched off the equipment and left, never returning again. Berlin erupted in celebration as news of swift victories poured in. Crowds filled the streets waving flags, convinced they were witnessing history's justice. State radios broadcast triumphant speeches, praising the courage of soldiers defending their homeland. The lie of Gleiwitz was now invisible, buried beneath patriotic pride. Yet among the cheering voices, some whispered doubts. A few officials who had helped orchestrate the plan began to realize what they had unleashed. Their deception had become too vast to contain. The machine they built for control was now operating on its own, fueled by belief and obedience. At the front lines, soldiers marched through villages reduced to rubble. They carried photographs of loved ones, thinking they were fighting for safety, unaware their cause was fiction. Officers reminded them that Poland had struck first, that their mission was righteous. Yet in private moments, many questioned why unarmed civilians fled in terror, if this was truly defense. The contrast between propaganda and what their eyes saw began to fracture faith. The seeds of doubt were small, but they would grow into guilt that haunted many long after the war had ended. In distant capitals, leaders watched with dismay. Britain and France issued final warnings that Germany ignored. Their hesitation proved costly. Within days, both nations declared war, not out of readiness, but out of obligation. The falsehood born in Gleiwitz had drawn the world into conflict. Diplomats who once dismissed the incident as minor now realized it was a spark that ignited global catastrophe. By the time reports confirmed inconsistencies, millions were already mobilizing. Lies can create momentum faster than truth can slow it. What began as a single-staged event had become a war without boundaries. Inside the Reich propaganda office, technicians compiled broadcasts for international audiences. They translated the Gleiwitz story into multiple languages, ensuring the deception reached beyond borders. Each translation bent slightly to match its listener's bias. It was not just a lie, it was tailored manipulation. In some versions, the attackers were portrayed as communist sympathizers, in others as Polish extremists. The flexibility made it believable everywhere. The propaganda team measured success not by truth, but by reach. They had learned that repetition was stronger than reason, and now the entire world echoed their fabrication. Across Poland, ordinary families tried to flee advancing armies. Fields turned to mud under the weight of tanks. Smoke rose from villages where rumors of betrayal spread faster than gunfire. Yet in many homes people still clung to disbelief, refusing to accept that a single broadcast had justified so much death. For them, the world felt upside down. They could not understand how anyone believed Poland had provoked such devastation. That confusion would turn into bitterness that endured for generations, a wound carved by disbelief more than bullets. Innocence had been weaponized beyond recovery. In secret briefings, German officers reviewed captured Polish documents, searching for anything that could retroactively justify their invasion. When nothing useful appeared, they forged new ones. Signatures were copied, Seals replicated. The fabricated papers were presented to journalists as proof of aggressive plans. The deception layered itself like sediment. Even those who knew the truth began to forget which version they had originally believed. Memory blurred with propaganda until only the state's version remained. The line between truth and fabrication vanished completely, leaving even historians decades later struggling to find what had truly happened. As the invasion advanced, reports from the front grew darker. Villages emptied, cities fell, and civilians filled roads seeking refuge. Yet German newspapers described these scenes as triumphs of order over chaos. Reality had been rewritten into victory slogans. Among military staff, some began to question how long the illusion could hold. Each new atrocity contradicted the claim of self-defense, but denial was easier than confession. The truth was no longer something that could be spoken aloud. Once a lie begins a war, exposing it becomes treason. Silence was survival, even for those burdened by knowledge. One courier carried sealed envelopes between departments, unaware of their contents. When curiosity overcame him, he opened one during a stop at a roadside inn. Inside was a detailed account of the Gleiwitz operation. Names, dates, and orders signed by high-ranking officials. He read it twice, realizing he held evidence of how the war began. Hours later, he was arrested for suspicion of disloyalty. The envelope vanished, and his name disappeared from all records. In systems built on lies, even truth becomes contraband. His brief act of curiosity was buried like every other inconvenient discovery. Within weeks, the lie had traveled farther than the men who created it. Radios across Europe repeated versions of the story with growing certainty. Each retelling stripped it of doubt until it sounded like fact. Even neutral nations began using it as a reference point. The propaganda had achieved immortality. A lie told in confidence had become a shared belief across borders. Germany's leadership no longer needed to defend it. The world had already memorized it. In that transformation lay the deepest danger. When deception becomes history, even evidence of truth feels like revisionism. Foreign correspondents sent to Germany during the early days of war were carefully managed. Tours were staged, access restricted. When journalists asked to visit Gleiwitz, their requests were denied politely but firmly. Officials provided pre-written statements and stage photographs instead. Every layer of censorship disguised itself as professionalism. The correspondents reported what they saw, not realizing everything they saw had been arranged. Their articles, printed in reputable newspapers, lent credibility to the hoax. Propaganda did not need to silence everyone. It only needed to guide the few who spoke the loudest. Control looked like cooperation. As the German army pushed deeper into Poland, officers in charge of propaganda began erasing evidence of Operation Himmler. The prisoners used as fake attackers were cremated, their records destroyed. The trucks that transported them were reassigned and repainted. The Gleiwitz station was scrubbed, repaired, and resumed full operation. Witnesses were reassigned or quietly eliminated. The goal was not only to hide the lie, but to remove any memory that it ever existed. For decades afterward, historians would search archives that no longer held the names of the dead. Oblivion had been built into the plan. Rumors of the false flag spread among lower-ranking soldiers who had overheard fragments of conversation. Most dismissed them as conspiracy or enemy propaganda. In an age without proof, truth sounded like madness. Those who repeated the rumor too loudly were reprimanded for damaging morale. The military machine had no patience for moral questions. By now, the war had a rhythm too strong to stop. Even if someone confessed, the world was already committed. The truth had lost its relevance once the tanks began to move. Wars rarely paused to correct their beginnings. In the months that followed, the Gleiwitz operation faded into obscurity. The public's focus shifted to victories in Warsaw and beyond. The radio station, once the centerpiece of the lie, became ordinary again. Its signal transmitted daily news, speeches and music. The irony lost on most listeners. For those who remembered its role, it stood as a monument to manipulation. They avoided looking at it directly, as though the tower itself might accuse them of knowing too much. History's greatest crimes often survive by blending back into normal life unnoticed. Gleiwitz had already succeeded in that. At home, Families of soldiers displayed portraits framed with pride. Letters from the front described bravery and honor. The newspapers called them heroes, defending their country. Few ever learned that their sons fought under false pretenses. The deception had seeped so deeply into society that even mourning carried propaganda. Mothers comforted themselves believing their sons died for justice. Truth could have destroyed that comfort, so it was never allowed to reach them. The lie became sacred, a shield for the grieving and a weapon for the powerful. Its grip outlived the men who created it. Across Europe, ordinary citizens struggled to make sense of the chaos. They heard both sides claim victimhood, both accuse the other of deceit. Without access to evidence, people chose belief based on fear, not reason. Information itself had become a battlefield. In that fog, the Gleiwitz broadcast was just one voice among thousands, but its echo carried the farthest. It proved that perception could be engineered, and once engineered, could not be undone. The truth no longer depended on facts but on repetition. And repetition was something the Reich had perfected beyond comprehension. Back in Berlin, intelligence officers continued refining operations similar to Gleiwitz. The success had inspired them. They drafted new strategies that blurred the line between espionage and theater. False stories of enemy attacks, sabotage plots, and assassinations filled the briefings. Each new deception built on the last, expanding into a network of lies that sustained the regime. Deceit had become policy. For those in charge, the Gleiwitz event was no longer shameful, but a model. It had shown that reality could be managed with precision. From then on, truth would always be subordinate to narrative. In underground circles, whispers about the false attack persisted. A few foreign agents gathered fragments of evidence, intercepted memos, strange troop movements, missing prisoners. The pieces hinted at something orchestrated, but proof remained elusive. Every lead ended with vanished witnesses or burned files. It was as though the event itself resisted discovery, protected by the machinery it had created. Some called it the perfect crime, one that achieved its goal before anyone realized it existed. By the time the war revealed its true scale, Gleiwitz had become a small, almost forgotten doorway to apocalypse. While cities burned, the architects of the false flag rose in rank. Their success earned them promotions and medals, proof that deceit was rewarded. None of them spoke about the operation again. Some convinced themselves it was necessary, others drowned guilt in discipline. The world saw only their public triumphs, not the private corrosion beneath. Power thrives on distance from consequence. The further these men climbed, the less anyone could question their beginnings. Gleiwitz had made them untouchable, at least for now. Every empire built on lies carries its architects upward before the fall begins. Meanwhile, the victims of the fabricated attack remained unnamed. Their families never received letters or explanations. They were prisoners erased from both sides of the record, existing only as props in history's cruelest stage. For years, their absence was not even noticed. The war's growing list of casualties buried them deeper into anonymity. They became part of a larger silence, the silence of people used, discarded, and forgotten. Their deaths proved nothing, justified nothing, yet shaped everything that followed. The moral cost of that one-stage scene reached farther than any battlefield victory ever could. Months after the invasion, as the Reich expanded its borders, a few surviving witnesses from Gleiwitz began to fear exposure. They met quietly, agreeing never to speak of the event again. One of them buried a small bundle under a tree near the tower. Papers, photos, and a single key tagged evidence. He never returned to retrieve it. When Allied investigators searched the site years later, they found nothing. Whether the bundle decayed, was taken, or never existed, remained unknown. Truth had been buried literally and figuratively, consumed by the soil of the world it had helped destroy. As the war dragged on, the propaganda that began with Gleiwitz evolved into a constant hum. Every victory and defeat was framed as destiny. Citizens no longer needed proof, they needed purpose. The government gave them both through stories, shaped by the same principles that began at that radio station. Lies no longer required effort, they sustained themselves. The population lived in a theater where every tragedy was rewritten into triumph. In such a world, even memory was suspect. The original false flag had achieved more than deceit. It had created a culture incapable of distinguishing truth from performance. Among captured German documents years later, Allied analysts found vague references to Operation Himmler. At first they assumed it was minor, then they read deeper. The files hinted at multiple coordinated deceptions designed to justify war. The Gleiwitz broadcast was just one. The analysts felt disbelief that something so small could ignite such catastrophe. The documents were incomplete, many pages redacted or missing, but enough remained to confirm the manipulation. It was the first time the full scale of strategic lying came into focus, showing how wars could begin not with bombs but with words. Historians examining early reports noticed inconsistencies. Timelines did not match. Witness accounts contradicted official statements. A few brave researchers began piecing together what had been erased. Their work uncovered fragments of memos, interviews, and survivor testimony. Each discovery chipped away at the official narrative. Yet for every document found, another had been lost forever. The pursuit of truth felt like chasing smoke. Decades after the broadcast, even uncovering the lie could not undo its effects. Gleiwitz had long since transformed from a crime into a warning, echoing through every future act of manufactured conflict. The deeper the investigation went, the more it revealed about human nature. The lie had worked not only because it was clever, but because people wanted to believe it. It gave them certainty, identity, and direction. That realization was more disturbing than the deception itself. Systems could be dismantled, files uncovered, but the instinct to follow comforting narratives remained untouched. The Gleiwitz incident became proof that manipulation succeeds when it aligns with emotion. The war it began was only one expression of a larger weakness: humanity's willingness to trade truth for belonging. For the few who had participated and survived into old age, memory became punishment. Some confessed quietly to interrogators after the war. Others carried the secret to their graves. Their testimonies, fragmented and hesitant, filled the gaps left by destroyed documents. Each account differed in detail, but agreed on one truth: the attack was staged, the prisoners were murdered, and the broadcast was the fuse. The Gleiwitz station still stood, weathered and quiet, a monument to deception. Its steel frame caught the wind like a sigh, a soundless reminder of how easily the world can be fooled. As Europe collapsed into full-scale war, the original architects of Operation Himmler disappeared into bureaucracy. Their names blended into layers of command, indistinguishable among countless officers. What had begun as one act of deception had become a template for every new lie. The methods refined at Gleiwitz were now applied to occupied territories: false reports, staged photos, and scripted confessions. Truth had become an administrative decision. The very people who once questioned the ethics of the false flag now use similar tactics daily. When survival depends on lies, morality becomes a forgotten luxury. The SS took complete control of all information about the incident. Files were moved into restricted archives under the label internal security. Anyone who requested them risked suspicion. Gleiwitz became a ghost event, referenced but never discussed. The regime treated it as myth, while relying on its legacy. Even within military academies, the story was sanitized, portrayed as a defensive response, not a fabrication. Students memorized it as proof of Poland's aggression. A generation grew up learning a war was justified, not manufactured. Propaganda had outlived the truth it replaced, solidifying the lie as doctrine. Inside occupied Poland, whispers of the real story persisted. Survivors of the border towns spoke quietly of trucks without insignia, and soldiers who spoke German, not Polish. Their accounts circulated in underground networks, but fear kept them contained. Resistance groups collected whatever evidence they could: fragments of uniforms, shell casings, notes smuggled from German soldiers. None of it could reach the outside world yet. Every witness risked execution for even mentioning Gleiwitz. Still, they whispered. The truth refused to die, clinging to memory even as those who carried it were hunted down one by one. As years passed, the line between truth and invention blurred completely. The war consumed everything, including the meaning of its own beginning. For most Germans, the invasion of Poland felt inevitable, a natural progression rather than a staged justification. History itself was being rewritten in real time, molded by victory reports, and carefully crafted speeches. Those who had once helped orchestrate the false flag began to believe their own propaganda. The mind protects itself by reshaping guilt into patriotism. By the time defeat loomed, even confession felt unnecessary. They thought history would never uncover their secret. When Allied forces finally reached Berlin, vast archives of Nazi documents were seized. Among them, a single folder labeled Special Actions, August 1939, drew attention. Inside were telegrams, instructions, and a list of operations that matched intelligence reports of false Polish attacks. Investigators pieced together the outline of something extraordinary, a deception on national scale, yet much was missing. Pages had been destroyed or altered beyond recognition. The folder offered glimpses, not proof. Still, the mention of Gleiwitz stood out like a stain. The first official acknowledgement of the lie that started the war had resurfaced. Narjoks, the officer who led the staged attack, was captured by Allied forces. Interrogators found him cautious but cooperative. He claimed to have acted under orders from Reinhard Heydrich, the SS general known for ruthless precision. At first, investigators doubted him. Then his details matched fragments found in other documents. He described the false uniforms, the prisoners, and the short radio message that set the world ablaze. For the first time, the story took shape from a human voice rather than a rumor. The confession revealed how small an act could trigger such endless destruction. During questioning, Narjoks explained that the prisoners used in the attack had been chosen days earlier. They were taken from concentration camps and referred to as canned goods, a code term for expendable evidence. The phrase horrified the interrogators. The idea that human beings were reduced to objects in an administrative plan confirmed how calculated the operation had been. Each piece of paperwork, every order, had turned human lives into props. The brutality wasn't impulsive, it was procedural. Gleiwitz became a symbol not just of deception, but of the bureaucracy that made evil efficient. Investigators compiled transcripts from Narjoks and cross-referenced them with captured German communications. The more they compared, the clearer the picture became. The attack had been approved by senior SS officials, coordinated from Berlin, and reported to Hitler himself. The evidence turned a once controversial rumor into fact. Still, the world struggled to accept it. Admitting that a war had begun from fiction challenged everything people wanted to believe about justice and purpose. The truth, now undeniable, revealed humanity's capacity to destroy itself, not only with weapons, but with words. Gleiwitz had been the match. In Nuremberg, prosecutors debated whether to include the Gleiwitz incident among charges against Nazi leaders. Some argued it was symbolic, a single act that exposed the deceit behind the entire war. Others believed it was too small compared to the atrocities that followed. Ultimately, it was included as evidence of deliberate aggression. Witnesses described the operation's planning, the execution, and the cover-up. In the courtroom, the words false flag entered public vocabulary for the first time. The phrase would outlive the trial, becoming shorthand for the manipulation of truth for power. Gleiwitz gave it meaning. The testimony of Narjoks circulated worldwide. Newspapers published summaries of his confession, though many readers dismissed it as propaganda from the victors. The idea that such a monumental war had started with a fake broadcast felt absurd. People preferred to believe in inevitability rather than orchestration, yet historians began collecting documents, forming the first coherent narrative of the event. Over time, disbelief turned into reluctant acknowledgement. The Gleiwitz attack transformed from conspiracy theory into historical fact. What once sounded like rumor became lesson, one that would shadow every government claim in future conflicts. The site of the Gleiwitz radio tower was left untouched for years after the war. Grass grew around rusting fences, and wind whistled through broken wires. Local children played nearby, unaware of its history. Eventually, a small plaque was added by the Polish government, marking it as the place where Germany faked its own victimhood. Tourists rarely visited, but those who did often stood in silence, unsure how to react. The building looked ordinary, only its story carried weight, a reminder that the smallest places can change the entire course of humanity. As new wars emerged in the decades after, the name Gleiwitz appeared again in debates and headlines. Whenever a government accused another of provocation, Skeptics invoked that station's memory. It became a warning carved into political discourse. Question the first story. The event's lesson wasn't limited to Germany. It applied to every nation with power to broadcast. History had proven that deception doesn't belong to one regime alone. Each generation rediscovers how easily truth bends under fear. Gleiwitz's shadow stretched beyond its geography, haunting every microphone that claimed to speak for justice. In academic circles, scholars argued whether the lie had truly been necessary. Some claimed Germany would have invaded Poland regardless. The false flag only provided theatrics. Others insisted it was crucial, a psychological justification that united the nation. This debate exposed the real horror, that the difference between necessity and manipulation had become irrelevant. Once people believe a story, the origin no longer matters. The Gleiwitz hoax didn't just start a war, it redefined how wars begin. It proved that the world doesn't need truth to act, only conviction strong enough to disguise doubt. Decades later, journalists unearthed additional evidence, a typed memo from 1939 signed by SS intelligence officers, describing Operation Himmler, successful outcome. The language was clinical, devoid of humanity. It confirmed every detail of Naujoks's confession. Yet even with proof, the event still felt unreal. The simplicity of it was too haunting. No grand conspiracy, no complex strategy, just a short broadcast and a handful of dead men. The revelation wasn't about military genius, but moral emptiness. Gleiwitz showed how ordinary bureaucracy, when guided by ideology, could manufacture chaos on a planetary scale. For survivors of the invasion, the exposure of the hoax brought little comfort. Their towns had been leveled, their families lost. The truth arrived decades too late to undo anything. What mattered to them was not how the war began, but how it never should have. Yet some took solace in knowing the lie had been unmasked. To acknowledge the deception was to restore a fragment of dignity to the dead. The Gleiwitz station, once a symbol of manipulation, slowly became a memorial, not of power, but of what humanity risks when truth becomes optional. Historians studying the era began linking the Gleiwitz event to broader patterns of psychological warfare. They noted how the manipulation of emotion could mobilize entire populations faster than logic ever could. The attack had demonstrated the power of narrative as a weapon. Governments learned from it, both to exploit and to guard against similar tactics. In intelligence circles, the phrase Gleiwitz model became shorthand for pretext operations. What began as a secret act of deception had become a textbook example of modern strategy. The past had been institutionalized, its lessons twisted into tools. Naujoks, released years after testifying, lived the rest of his life in obscurity. He avoided interviews and settled in a quiet town under a false name. Neighbors described him as polite but distant, a man who never looked comfortable in his own skin. Rumors spread that he drank heavily and spoke to no one about his past. Some said he kept a small wooden box containing his old SS badge and a single bullet, perhaps the one missing from the revolver used at Gleiwitz. His silence was not peace, it was punishment. The more people studied the hoax, the clearer it became that Gleiwitz represented something larger than war. It was a mirror held up to human nature. The event showed how easily morality can be reshaped when collective fear replaces reason. The soldiers, officers, and citizens who played their parts were not monsters, they were ordinary people, convinced of necessity. That realization disturbed scholars more than the deception itself. The horror of Gleiwitz lay not in its genius, but in its normality. Evil doesn't always disguise itself as chaos. Sometimes it looks like order perfectly executed. In later decades, filmmakers and authors revisited the story, trying to capture its moral complexity. Some portrayed it as tragedy, others as warning. None could convey the full weight of knowing that 1 minute of false radio transmission had led to years of devastation. Audiences found the story both distant and familiar, recognizing its echoes in modern conflicts. The Gleiwitz operation became timeless because it revealed a truth that never expired. Once people choose belief over evidence, the consequences extend far beyond the lie itself. Reality becomes whatever power declares it to be. Museums dedicated to World War II began including sections on propaganda and misinformation. In one exhibit, visitors listened to a recreation of the Gleiwitz broadcast, the static breaking, the voice trembling with fake urgency. Standing in front of the speaker, many described a strange feeling, not fear but disbelief that such a simple act could ignite such ruin. The lesson was clear but uncomfortable. Humanity had learned how fragile truth could be, yet continued testing that boundary. The exhibit's sign read, "The war began here with words." It was both history and warning in the same breath. Each passing generation moved farther from the event, yet its relevance refused to fade. Political leaders still invoked fear to rally nations, and journalists still raced to broadcast first and verify later. The mechanisms that made Gleiwitz possible had only grown faster and louder. Technology had changed, but the psychology had not. The story's endurance came from repetition, the same flaw that created it. Every century rediscovers how truth can be manufactured. Gleiwitz lived on not because people remembered, but because the pattern it revealed never truly ended. It had become eternal instruction. Some historians uncovered a diary believed to belong to a technician from the Gleiwitz station. The entries stopped abruptly on August 31st, 1939. The final line read, "Orders make us liars." The authenticity of the diary was debated, but the sentence resonated across time. It encapsulated the human conflict at the heart of the story, the surrender of conscience to obedience. Whether real or apocryphal, the phrase became symbolic of the event's moral collapse. It reminded readers that every falsehood needs participation, that silence is the foundation upon which every great lie is built. Poland eventually restored the radio station as a cultural site. Students visited to study history, not from textbooks, but from walls still carrying the echo of deceit. Guides explained how the building's neutrality made it the perfect weapon. An ordinary structure turned into a stage for global manipulation. Standing beneath the tower, visitors often remarked on its quietness. The absence of sound felt heavier than noise. It was as though the world had paused to listen, realizing too late how easily truth can be stolen, not through violence, but through performance. As global politics shifted through the Cold War, both superpowers used the term Gleiwitz as accusation. Each side warned the other of staging provocations to justify conflict. The story became both shield and sword, invoked to claim moral superiority, while repeating similar strategies. The irony was endless. The event born from deception had become a rhetorical weapon in future deceptions. Its legacy was not only remembrance but replication. The world had learned from Gleiwitz, just not the lesson it needed most. Truth remained fragile, forever dependent on those willing to defend it at great personal cost. By the end of the 20th century, the Gleiwitz incident stood as one of the most analyzed and referenced false flags in modern history. Scholars, journalists, and philosophers alike returned to it, searching for meaning. Some called it a failure of morality, others, a masterpiece of manipulation. Yet beneath the debate lay a single, undeniable truth. The world went to war because men chose fiction over fact. The broadcast lasted less than a minute. Its consequences lasted generations. Gleiwitz proved that history doesn't need bombs to explode. Sometimes, a microphone is enough. As the 21st century began, the lessons of Gleiwitz resurfaced again and again. Each new crisis, each suspicious event, drew comparisons to that night in 1939. Commentators warned of manipulation, yet history kept repeating its rhythm. Modern technology amplified the same old tactics: false images, scripted outrage, staged evidence. What once required soldiers and a radio tower could now be done with a keyboard. Gleiwitz was no longer just a location, it had become a method. Humanity's greatest advancement was not in invention, but in how efficiently it could disguise lies as truth. The name Gleiwitz began appearing in classrooms worldwide. Teachers used it as a case study in ethics, journalism, and politics. Students listened to the story, shocked that something so small could cause so much destruction. Some asked how anyone could have believed it. The uncomfortable answer came quickly, because people wanted to. Belief had always been easier than analysis. That realization unsettled them. It wasn't just a history lesson, it was a mirror. The story of Gleiwitz was less about a single regime, and more about a human flaw that never stopped evolving with time. Archivists continued restoring damaged wartime files. Among them, they discovered a telegram dated the morning after the fake attack. addressed to Berlin's high command. It read simply, "Broadcast complete, awaiting movement order." The message was brief but damning. It linked the deception directly to the invasion's launch. Reading it decades later, researchers felt a strange chill, realizing that those words had unleashed chaos across continents. The telegram was framed in a museum exhibit, displayed under glass. Visitors leaned close to read it, often whispering the same thought: how could so few words cost so many lives? Polish historians dedicated years to identifying the unnamed prisoners used in the operation. They examined camp records, transport lists, and fragments of personal belongings. After decades, they managed to confirm only 2 names. The rest were lost to erasure. Their families never received closure, their graves unknown. Yet the act of searching itself mattered. It was a rejection of the dehumanization that had made the deception possible. Those forgotten men had been erased from memory, but in rediscovering them, historians restored fragments of humanity stolen by the machinery of lies. Silence no longer had the final word. The restored radio tower still functioned as part of a local broadcast network. Every evening, it transmitted music and news across the region, unaware of its own legacy. Some residents avoided tuning in, claiming the sound carried a strange heaviness, as if the past still vibrated within the signal. During commemorations, the station played a brief tone in honor of the victims. The gesture was small, almost ceremonial, but it mattered. It turned the tool of deceit into a memorial of awareness, a reminder that the same instrument capable of lies could also carry truth. Governments around the world began creating policies against disinformation, citing Gleiwitz as the earliest known example of a weaponized broadcast. Yet even those laws carried irony. Regulation itself could become manipulation when written by those in power. The lesson was complex. Control of truth cannot be trusted to those who benefit from controlling it. Scholars argued that transparency, not censorship, was the only real safeguard. But transparency required courage, and courage was rare. Humanity still sought security more than truth. That trade, repeated through centuries, was the true inheritance of Gleiwitz. Survivors of the war who were still alive watched these discussions unfold with weary recognition. They had lived through propaganda once and could recognize its echoes instantly. To them, the new debates felt familiar, the same denial, the same appeals to patriotism. When asked what they remembered most, they rarely spoke of battle. They spoke of words, of broadcasts, of the moment belief replaced evidence. One survivor described it simply: "The world changed the night we decided to trust a voice we couldn't see." The tragedy wasn't just that it happened, but that it kept happening. At international memorials, the Gleiwitz incident was often recited alongside the first casualties of World War II. Yet unlike most battlefields, no blood was honored there, only the victims of deception. Speakers warned audiences that the war had not started with tanks or soldiers, but with a performance. The story's quiet beginning made it even more terrifying. People left those ceremonies thoughtful, some shaken. The simplicity of it was its power. Gleiwitz showed that evil does not need force to win. It needs only belief, repeated often enough until it feels like memory. Digital archives eventually preserved every known document about the operation. Scanned images of memos, telegrams, and photos were uploaded online, accessible to anyone willing to look. For the first time, the full story was transparent. Yet the same internet that hosted truth also spread falsehood faster than ever. Conspiracy theories emerged claiming Gleiwitz was exaggerated or even fabricated by the Allies. The irony completed the circle. The event born from lies was now denied through new ones. History had become a battlefield again, not of nations, but of narratives fighting for ownership of reality. On the anniversary of the attack, a Polish filmmaker produced a short documentary titled 1 Minute to War. It recreated the night of August 31st, using only verified records. The film ended with silence instead of credits, a full 60 seconds without sound. Viewers described it as the most haunting part, a pause heavy with consequence. The absence of noise forced them to imagine what followed: the invasion, the destruction, the decades of suffering born from that quiet act of deceit. The film didn't accuse, it warned, and audiences understood exactly what it meant. In universities, Ethics professors used the Gleiwitz case to explore moral boundaries. Was obedience an excuse? Could patriotism justify deceit? Students debated fiercely, but often reached the same conclusion. Fear had made monsters of ordinary people. The story's power lay in its realism, not its exaggeration. Everyone could imagine themselves in that station, following orders, convincing themselves it was for the greater good. That uncomfortable empathy was the real education. History's worst moments weren't the work of villains alone. They required cooperation from those who thought they were just doing their jobs. Governments continued referencing Gleiwitz whenever new military actions were questioned. Some cited it as a cautionary tale, others as justification for their own narratives. The name became detached from its origin, used symbolically more than historically. Yet every mention carried a faint echo of the original sin. It reminded the world that truth is fragile, that every headline can be a spark. The station's story endured not because people wanted to remember it, but because they couldn't afford to forget. Gleiwitz had become more than a location. It had become a warning carved into conscience. In the archives of Nuremberg, researchers uncovered a single photograph showing the Gleiwitz operatives moments before the staged attack. They were dressed in Polish uniforms, their faces calm, almost indifferent. The image captured none of the chaos that would follow. It looked mundane, like a rehearsal before a play. That was the horror, the ordinariness. Those men were not compelled by rage or ideology alone, but by routine. Evil often begins in the comfort of procedure. The photograph became one of the most studied images of the war, a portrait of obedience before disaster. When scholars presented the photograph in lectures, they emphasized not the men's actions, but their expressions. Each face showed detachment, the quiet confidence of people convinced they were doing something necessary. That small detail resonated deeply. It revealed that deception often begins not with passion, but with calm efficiency. Students left those lectures thoughtful, realizing how danger hides in normalcy. The more organized a lie becomes, the more believable it appears. Gleiwitz was not chaos, it was coordination, and that made it the most frightening kind of evil order, turned against truth. A memorial service held in Gleiwitz decades later gathered survivors, historians, and families of those lost in the war. The air was still, the speeches short. A musician played a single violin piece, written by a composer who had survived Auschwitz. The notes drifted softly through the crowd, carrying no words, only memory. Attendees described the feeling as fragile, the silence afterward as sacred. It wasn't forgiveness they felt, but understanding. The tower behind them stood unchanged, a monument to how easily lies can echo through generations, when courage to confront them comes too late. Years later, the phrase false flag entered common language far beyond military circles. It appeared in headlines, social debates, and conspiracy forums. Yet most who used it had never heard of Gleiwitz. The original meaning was lost beneath endless repetition. Still, the connection remained invisible, but intact. Every claim of manufactured crisis carried traces of that first deception. History had given humanity both a vocabulary and a warning, but few recognized how costly it had been to earn. Every careless accusation diluted its gravity, turning tragedy into cliché. The truth's sharp edge dulled under misuse. Philosophers studying modern propaganda called Gleiwitz the genesis of misinformation. They argued that it marked the moment when manipulation became indistinguishable from reality. Before then, lies supported ideology. After, ideology supported lies. The direction had reversed. The operation showed how narratives could override morality and perception simultaneously. What terrified them most was how rational it seemed on paper, precise, justified, efficient. Evil had evolved from chaos into administration. Gleiwitz wasn't the birth of propaganda, it was its perfection, and everything that came after followed its blueprint, consciously or not. As global tensions rose in new centuries, parallels to 1939 reappeared. Citizens everywhere debated whether they were being misled by their governments. The question of truth became political, rather than moral. Experts warned that history was cycling again, repeating its mistakes through different technologies. Gleiwitz became the reference point for every discussion about manipulated events. Yet the repetition proved the lesson unlearned. Humanity still underestimated how quickly facts could be replaced by conviction. The tragedy of the past had become the manual of the present. Gleiwitz was no longer history, it was prophecy fulfilled. Late one night, a researcher monitoring old broadcast archives found a faint recording believed to be the original Gleiwitz transmission. The voice was distorted but clear enough to understand, a frantic message blaming Poland for an attack. The researcher listened several times, then sat in silence. It was unremarkable, even mundane, yet it changed the world. That realization felt heavier than any scream could. The recording was preserved, not as evidence, but as reminder. Words don't need volume to destroy. They only need an audience willing to believe without question. Modern-day journalists continue to cite the Gleiwitz operation when discussing ethics. For them, it symbolized both the power and responsibility of information. They debated whether neutrality was possible in a world where every fact could be weaponized. Many concluded that honesty was no longer enough. Vigilance was required. Gleiwitz had proven that lies thrive not only through deceit, but through indifference. The moment people stop caring about truth, manipulation wins by default. That insight turned the incident from history into duty, an eternal demand for awareness whenever words claim to represent reality. At the old radio station, a new generation of technicians worked among modern equipment. Most of them were young, unaware of the building's legacy, until a local historian visited to tell the story. When she finished, silence filled the room. The workers looked at the glowing control boards, realizing they now held the same power once used for destruction. One of them muttered that every broadcast carries responsibility. The historian nodded and said nothing more. Outside, the tower lights blinked against the night, signaling not warning, but remembrance. The past still hummed through the wires. Over time, the tower became both symbol and scar. Couples took wedding photos beneath it. School trips visited. Historians lectured beside it. The duality was striking, ordinary life thriving around the remains of manipulation. Some saw it as healing, others as indifference. The truth was likely both. Humanity doesn't erase its past, it learns to coexist with it. The tower's continued presence proved that destruction and creation often share the same foundation. What once transmitted lies now stood as a monument of truth, its steel frame catching the light instead of the signal. In the archives of international courts, a final report summarized the incident's significance. It concluded that Gleiwitz was not merely an event but a process, one that revealed how information could become a weapon of war. The authors warned that technology would only magnify that danger. Their closing line read, "History begins not with what happens, but with what is believed." That sentence echoed across academic papers for decades. It distilled the essence of the entire tragedy, the understanding that wars may end, but belief, once corrupted, continues to fight long after the weapons fall silent. Each year, as anniversaries passed, fewer people attended the commemorations, yet the story never vanished. Documentaries were uploaded, books reprinted, lectures recorded. Gleiwitz existed in 1,000 retellings, each carrying fragments of warning. Its persistence was both tragic and necessary. Humanity needs reminders of its failures to recognize its patterns. The false flag that started the Second World War had outlived those who planned it, those who exposed it, and those who denied it. The story remained because it had to. Without it, the next lie would arrive unrecognized, wearing the same disguise. Today, the Gleiwitz Tower stands quietly against the skyline, its metal darkened by time. The world around it has changed. New borders, new nations, new technologies, but its outline remains the same. Tourists take photographs without always knowing its history. Some read the plaque and walk away thoughtful, others indifferent. Yet the tower doesn't need attention to matter. Its silence speaks louder than any broadcast it ever sent. It stands as proof that truth, once broken, can echo forever, reminding humanity that belief without evidence is the most dangerous weapon ever built.